Hey, good morning, Luke.
Morning.
Part 2, our FearTalk 2. I asked you if you could perhaps introduce or create some kind of context for our talk this morning. Would you do that, please?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I made this little bundle of tobacco this morning, and I've been spending a lot of time working with the tobacco down at the UBC Indigenous Health Research and Education Gardens, and learning from some of the elders that are part of the medicine collective down there in terms of how to respectfully and reciprocally engage with the tobacco spirit and what the role of the tobacco is in the kind of broader holistic medicinal process. And tobacco is often described by the elders as the chief medicine. And it's described that way because it's the medicine with which we approach all other medicines. If we're going to go out and respectfully harvest the medicine, we'll lay down tobacco, we'll make an offering of tobacco to that spirit. One thing that is helpful for me for understanding this is the rings of the smoke from the tobacco spiral up towards the heavens in a very similar way to the eagle. And the eagle, the teachings are similar about the eagle being a mediator between our world and the spirit world. So I just want to make this offering to the land, to the Mother Earth from which we were all born, and to the ancestors of this land, both Musqueam people, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and of course all of our non-human kin, the eagles, the owls, the red cedars, the Douglas fir, the hemlock, all of our friends that we spend time with in the forest, and to my ancestors, and to the waters, and to the blood that runs through me and connects me to the whole, and of course to the Creator, and to the skies that watch over us all. And I appreciate that prayer because it grounds us in the space that we're in the relationship with the ancestors who have inhabited this space, and it grounds us in the waters that mediate between the heavens and the earth, and it grounds us in that blood that runs through us that connects us to our ancestral stream and also to the great ancestral stream of life. I have a feeling that if we go far enough back in that stream, we may come to something that's shared between all of us. And then, of course, to the skies and to the Creator and to that nothing, infinite, eternal force of the great mystery that enlivens all of these. So I'm just hoping that this way of entering into the conversation will allow us to approach the spirit world in a healthy and reciprocal way through this conversation and just make an offering to the spirit so that perhaps they can help to guide us through this conversation, provide some intuition. Thank you very much. I'll bring this out to the forest later and put it into the altar.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about doing the Fear Talks, in a sense, is great with digital, and it is a type of methodology that other people could practice themselves, and we can certainly share our videos so people can get a chance to see how they unfold or one way. And yet, I think you were also saying the limitation of this. Could you just...
Yeah, so I mean, at some level, obviously I can still see your face and I can hear your voice and I can see some of what's going on, but I can't experience your emotions. I can't experience the shift in your body language in the same way as we're conversing. And I think that maybe speaks to something that is lost through digital communication and perhaps to a broader dimension of fear and modernity, which is this disconnection that's being created through these kinds of means of communication. So, I mean, usually if I'm going to practice ceremony, I'm going to be out in the woods, or I'm going to be in the garden, or I'm going to be on the land. I'm not going to be inside of a house, at least probably in a spiritual building like a longhouse rather than a townhouse that was built for consumptive purposes. And it's had a lot, dozens, I'm sure, people through the years living here, and also, it's not perhaps the most optimal space for this kind of thing. So there's definitely maybe something to be said for trying to find a way to, if we have really good fear talks, perhaps, use that as a seed to then find a place where we can sit together and perhaps be out in nature. And
Yeah, I think it really relates to me. Something that you talk a lot about in your work lately that you've been sharing with me is this word intimacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one of the things I want to start off our talk with, if you could, what is this intimacy that you speak to that seems so important? And it's related to fear, it's related to courage, to fearlessness, to fearless, in some kind of way, without getting hung up in that right now. But there's this intimacy with the nothing, infinity, and the eternal. So NIE for short, a concept you use. And I'd like you to, if you could help me, just how did you come to that? Because it seems to be it almost seems, I'm being a bit crass, something you worship. And that maybe isn't crass, but that actually comes to me when I look at your work. And I actually am very interested in that, not just abstractly.
So to begin with the notion of intimacy, I would see that as the result of love. And I think of love perhaps through the metaphor of attraction or of gravity, of the forces that pull bodies together. Once the bodies are pulled together and that distinction between self and other breaks down, and we recognize ourselves as intimate. So that intimacy perhaps is tied to a lessening of the seeming distinction between self and other, the breakdown of it's not the breakdown of the ego, but it's a recognition of the ego as a part of the self. So there's a teacher who I've worked with up in the mountains called Christine Jack, and she's a wonderful teacher. She's up at a place called Ulush defending the land against logging companies and things like that. And they've been successful at this point. They've had to build big roads around this sacred spot where two nations used to meet at the river. So she's doing good work. One of the teachings that she focuses on a lot, at least in conversations with me, is this notion that we may have it a little bit backwards in terms of ego and the way that we ought to relate to ego. I think a lot of the ancient Eastern traditions that are, often thought of in terms of transcending the ego or things like that may have risen in response to a sickness. There was a sickness of ego that caused some problems on Earth quite a few thousand years ago. And many of these traditions that are up in the mountains and are these small monastic orders, I see them as kind of, one, designed so as to preserve the mysteries through the era that has happened since then until the day that we're in, where it can all come out of its sacred containers and come back together and the medicine can be made. But also a response to the sickening of ego that caused that fall in the first place. And so in many of those practices that are about separating us from the ego or transcending the ego, or even some people would talk about like killing the ego or something like that, I get it. There needs to be death before there can be rebirth. There is a need for the sickened ego to die and to be reborn. But then the ego needs to be reborn. And there's something about the way that the ego picks up our context that we've lived in and grounds us in our own manifest existence. It's an important tool. And so maybe, just being sensitive to this notion that we need to deal with ego, and we definitely need to heal ego. And perhaps the way that ego is formed by hierarchical civilization, the only healing that can be attained is through the death of ego. But we then need to focus on the fact that out on the cliff, you have the dead tree in the Taoist tradition. And the moment of enlightenment comes in the deep of winter when the tree is out on the crag. But then the tree comes back to life. Then the winter is over and the spring returns. And that dead tree that we needed to become to be filled with light grows back and it blossoms again. The leaves come back. And so I think maybe we could think of the ego in those terms. And then the issue of the nothing, infinite, eternal kind of relates to this notion of the dead tree. One thing that I think of is, from my reading, Zhuangzi and Lao Tzu, the Taoist cosmology might be articulated as 0, 1, 2, 3. And so you start with the infinite nothingness, with the nothingness that is full of potency, with the full nothingness. And from that emerges the infinite. So the 0 begets the 1. And so you have the nothing and you have the intimate, and they are one as much as they are two. The 0 and the 1 are the same in a certain sense, in as much as they're different. And so that's the nothing and the infinite. And then eternal is simply to just kind of connote the dimensional quality of that 0 and that 1. The Pythagorean cosmology, on the other hand, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 10. And so in the Western cosmology, in Western mysticism, they start with the infinite. And I think, patriarchy might pretty easily emerge from something that denies the zero, that denies the nothing, that denies the womb from which the infinite was born, and starts with that infinite that is born out of the womb of nothingness. And so that, I think, part of what I'm trying to do with that notion of the nothing, infinite, eternal is to critique patriarchy and to reformulate the numerological cosmology from which patriarchy emerged in the Western world through this integrating the zero back into things. And this, it's the silence, it's the quiet, it's the darkness, it's all the things that are vilified by patriarchal society. I think the dark thing for me, like black and white, night and day, that's the false binary that's been built up, that rises out of the Western twin myths of the solar twin killing the lunar twin, or dominating or rising over, or something, some kind of hierarchical relationship. And so I hope that by emphasizing the beauty of the night, the beauty of restfulness, of sleep, of the intimacy of the baby while it's in the womb, we might return to a more harmonious balance between the matriarchal and the patriarchal. I don't really like either of those terms, the matrilineal and the patrilineal, perhaps. The archy still connotes domination, whether it's matri or patri. So I think maybe there's some space to just try and get the word archy out of our vocabulary completely. But, returning to balance between the twins.
Nice. I was thinking of Carl Jung coming up with his notion of 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. He was trying to find some principles of the psyche, as I understand what he was trying to do. Again, not emphasizing, as far as I can tell, the zero, the prior. So just very briefly, how I play a little bit with that, not near what you're speaking to totally, but in terms of fear, and the development of fear to fearless, let's say. So in the zero, that part of the cosmology, that is what I call no fear. And I use that term very specifically. And the reason is that term no fear actually shows up in a lot of literature. It showed up in the 90s movements, the no fear sportswear. And it was a very terrifying, scary time. AIDS was around, ecological issues were getting worse and worse. And I thought that younger generation was touching on an impulse, a spirit. And I thought it was the spirit of fearlessness. So, but it framed it because of not really sort of understanding the full spectrum of which we're talking about today, the spectrum of 0, 1, 2, 3, and this developmental spectrum, this evolutionary spectrum. They just chose the language that was hip and cool, and it was no fear. But that meant a lot. Like, that's pretty interesting when you've got a culture, or as part of a subculture, putting out no fear with this kind of brashness, a resistance. And it's taken a few different forms, and then it got appropriated, that term. I think it was fearless feminine or fearless female something for Cosmopolitan magazine, and fearless has really been appropriated completely. And so a lot of my work was trying to sort those terms out that were in discourses. So below in that transition from 0 to 1, I just said, well, that's the time of no fear. And it's sort of like, fear is not a concept, right? It actually is null. And yet I use it there in that sort of preparatory or even vulnerability of easily being manufactured, because there's a certain vulnerability to being a living organism. And so I'm speaking within the living world mostly right now, not in the mineral world, not so much. But once you move into the living world, because then you've kind of got entropy and negentropy, and you've got this dynamic force about whether you're going to live tomorrow, or basically your energy is not going to be around, and you're out in that form for a while. So then I kind of started moving. In one was that's where I put bravery, which was that first when fear starts to become a bit of a reality of life, you've got this choice. The spirit of fearlessness then takes the form of bravery, which I sort of say it's when you do something unexpected and you're kind of amazed. Holy crap, I can't believe I did that. And somebody says, wow, you're so brave. And you go, I probably wouldn't have chose to do that. So it's kind of more unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we have that spirit still within us. It's that life spirit to defend, to arise to the challenges, right, of being threatened.
Mm-hmm.
And so then courage is after that. So we're starting to move to 2 and 3. And I put courage sort of next as one of the manifestations, forms of spirit of fearlessness, because courage starts to ask for a more interiority of contemplation, of reflection.
Mm-hmm.
And then sort of all the way up the line. So I was playing with that spectrum a little bit.
This is just reminding me of something that I was writing about yesterday, which is I was trying to conceive of different forms of courage in relationship to, say, the emotion that is giving rise to that sense of courage. So be it ignorance or anger or love and so maybe we need something of a relational ontology in this discussion in terms of trying to understand, instead of defining bravery intrinsically or courage intrinsically or fearlessness intrinsically, trying to think of how different impetuses give rise to different qualities of these things so that the ontology of bravery or courage is in relationship to the emotion or to the stimuli that is giving rise to it.
Contextual, right? Contingent.
Yeah.
And I totally agree. I think that's the subtle nuancing that we've got to get down. Whether that way, I was really saying, could we maybe use these words more carefully to understand there's an ontological development of sensitivity toward those, whether people adopt that or not. It was my arcing, right, of the big possibilities of thinking of these languages more carefully, and then knowing we even have options, more or less, certainly as an adult, we have the options of, regaining some of that sense of no fear, which I think is part of your intimacy toward the NIE. Mm-hmm. And that can be a very powerful regrounding or re-referencing to then how you practice bravery, courage, fearlessness, spirit.
Yeah. And so then there is something of this intrinsic ontology that goes through those terms, but it also still always relates to what the impetus is that is enlivening each of those terms. So if it's that intimacy with the nothing, infinite, eternal that's enlivening bravery, takes on perhaps a more eternal quality than it would if it was being enlivened by, say, anger or jealousy or some sort of finite emotion that burns out. I liked that term from 4 Arrows of talking about burning out, and this distinction between courage that burns out and the fearlessness that he says he's never seen burn out. I think there's something of this discussion of the eternal in that. When the stimuli that is giving rise to courage is eternal, then the courage itself has the capacity, perhaps not to be eternal because it is manifest, but it doesn't have the necessity of burning out. It can. There's no kind of. You could carry it on for your whole life if you were in the right context and the right state of being, whereas anger can't carry that out for very long without it burning. It must burn out.
Yeah, very interesting. I was thinking also of the courage that, let's just say, doesn't burn out, if we're going to just use that term for now. And that's why I was so interested in fearlessness per se, is trying to distinguish that, because in the West, in the discourses, courage is a pretty big term, and it's pretty honorable. And so I was continuing to. I said I wanted to stretch that, right, so that we don't just stop at courage. Yeah. And I think what 4 Arrows is maybe touching here is, the courage that's doesn't burn out. So that's an interesting play. So here's my quick take on that is, the courage that doesn't burn out cares about learning about fear ongoing, continually, ever ending. Because that relationship of fear to courage, just if we take those, It's continually contingent. It's continually environmentally context. If you live in a culture of fear, like I arguable and many people argue we are, what happens to our relationship to fear in a culture of fear? It's not the same fear. You know that it's so invested in morphing itself in terms of power, knowledge, fear productions. You've got to study fear ongoing to have a courage that doesn't burn out. So I think there's sort of a behavioral courage that doesn't burn out, and that's more what I hear Forero speaking to. And then there's sort of a historical evolutionary notion of the courage that doesn't burn out, and that's how I would situate it. It's always under the study of, you have to study fear. And Forero actually touches on that in his first book, Primal Awareness. Becoming a connoisseur of fear.
Interesting.
That is not normally used when we think of courage.
I think it's beautiful, though. It accepts fear as a natural part of human existence and seeks to have a healthy relationship with that natural fear. True courage, the courage to accept that you will be fearful, and knowing that you'll have the strength to overcome it.
I love that. The courage to accept that you will be. And again, you see, when we have an actual ontological mapping, like we were been talking about, 0 to 1 to 3, and then when we start aligning some of these terms on that ontological developmental, and it's really a spiral, I think it's a spiral of development. If we were to look at it more nuanced, and I'm interested in that spiral form as trying to understand how evolution works in multiple levels and reintegrates continually. I just think that we would just have so much better education in having more choices of what we're accessing and how we can access and how we can go to the next level, if you want to use that, the next level on the spiral, which I think in the last video, you talked about the adept, that there are adepts who have made it past the first few rungs. And we need to include include their groove, their evolutionary groove. And, we can say, well, they're outstanding or they're exceptional, or maybe the circumstances were just right. No doubt that's true. But in a sense, if we're all one spirit, it's just a matter of, let's learn from the other part of spirit that's already gone there. So don't have to put it in a, quote, hierarchy in that sense. It's more in a nested spiral of distinctions.
There's no domination of the higher over the lower, simply guidance.
And every sort of level of that spiral it's contingently evolved for the certain circumstances and for solving certain problems that were the best strategies at the time.
And I think, as a planner, as someone who thinks of collective human habitation, I'm interested in how that spiral of individuals relates to the collective spiral that we're on. And you talked about context and the right situations being there for the adepts to have attained what they attained. How do we build collective human habitation that creates those contexts? How do we integrate spiritual places into the landscape? How do we integrate nature not sullied by our attempts to draw the straight lines of modernist improvement into the lived environment? But, a lot of what runs through my work is this notion of conscious cultural evolution. And it is to say that humans no longer evolve in the same way as biological life evolved to the point of the emergence of the self-aware human consciousness. The moment that self-awareness is there, evolution turns a corner and it becomes a far more, epistemological, emotional, spiritual process. It's about directing the will inwards towards cultivation of the invisible self, towards actualization of inner capacities like reason and intuition and virtue and wisdom and love, and so then, how do we replan human society? How do we create new social systems and political systems and economic systems and legal systems that will actually facilitate that movement to the new rung that you're talking about? And that's where I think we need to go, because we've had lots of adepts through history. There have been plenty of individuals who have shown us different ways of attaining that state. but for us to actually relate to like the rest of the world that we live in and the rest of the universe and the rest of the, milieu of dimensions that we're embedded in, we all need to at least attain some shred of it. We need to, as a species, move into that new rung of the cycle. We need to do something a little bit more expansive. So I don't know. I wonder if you have thoughts on maybe some potential roads towards that. Do we need to get people's consciousness to the place where they can do it first? Are there maybe small things that we can do along the way to start to set the context for that? Is it possible within a liberal democratic framework, or will there need to be revolution against the system to even make moving into that rung possible?
This is great, and I'm glad you brought up the sense of that big picture planning and design, and because I'm an educator, curriculum maker, so, and I know you're interested in curriculum too. So this is how to come up with a critical, and I use the word integral model approach. That combination and kind of critical theory from some of those traditions. Then we've got indigenous feeding into that, and then we've got integral as well. So it's complex. And what I come to almost over and over again in my work is we have to move from a coping culture to a healing culture. And this is so fundamental to our everyday practices and design of what has happened. And it's that moment that we moved from, because there's just no doubt in my mind that not only all living creatures know how to heal. When you're hurt, you heal. Basic law. And human societies learned that too, but culture starts to get a little complex. And that law can be forgotten.
Or obfuscated.
Obfuscated.
Domination of humanity on a mass scale requires that we are made to forget how to heal ourselves. We have to remain in that state of traumatic fear to be able to be governed in the way that we're being governed. Yeah. Similar to a factory farm in maybe emotive epistemological terms.
So we're this kind of culture, the dominant worldview, the artificial worldview, is to me a coping culture. And I find this language when I go out and speak to audiences of people who are maybe not very sophisticated in terms of intellectual and big picture and stuff. But when I use that language, they sort of get it. And they'll at least listen. Well, what's the difference between coping and healing? And I sort of fundamentally said, well, the first thing in a coping culture is when you're injured, you have all kinds of automatic natural healing responses that come. Things like crying, laughing, sweating, shaking, trembling, talking through the issue that happened. You need attention. You need attention, unconditional receiving attention. I believe that is that love that you speak about earlier. It is essential to the healing process itself because it brings bondedness in a good way when there's the tendency to possibly fragment and dissociate from the whole, from the commune, from your body, from your soul. And I know Foros just given some interesting stories about the shamans and the Raramari shamans in Mexico, where he studied, where, this little girl was frightened at a cliff and just about fell. And when the shaman went out and Foros went with him, the main thing he was doing is he said, oh, she was frightened and one of her souls left. And so she was actually getting sick. She was pretty violently sick. And so he went out and did ritual at the site of this cliff to bring back that soul, right? I from a psychological point of view, that's the dissociated part. And again, I'm not trying to reduce the indigenous view to psychology, but that's where I come from.
Parallels.
And so that shift, that is what I think we can do. We have to bring healing practices back. And one of the things I've noticed talking to people is they don't know what their natural healing mechanisms are. Mm-hmm. And so there's, 8 or 9 or 10 of them. There's probably more, but those are, I gave you a list of a few. And so then you say, and so when those mechanisms arise, when we're in a moment of hurt or pain, we deserve attention. And when there's a shortage of attention, or the tension actually is directed at suppressing those arising natural healers. Don't cry, right, would be the classic one. Grow up and be like the rest of us. Why? Because we had to give up. We had to give up our natural healer in our generation. And now this goes back so far. Perhaps, as Foro says, it might go back 10,000 years when we were starting to shift from a healing culture to a coping culture.
Yeah. That notion really makes a lot of sense to me of healing and coping, because when I think of Western medicine, I think of attempts to treat symptoms and not to treat causes. I mean, flu vaccinations are perhaps one of the best examples of, I don't seek to treat any of the causes of our like over-densified living environment, of the way that capitalism has led us to design our habitation. We're all packed into these tiny areas and breeding all of these different diseases. We simply try and treat humanity like a herd and inject them. It's just, we don't go to the cause. I think of the statistics in terms of medical spending between the US and Japan, and where Japan spends like a third of what the US spends per capita on healthcare. Their average lifespan, their average health rates are much, much higher than the United States. And, you know, there's probably many factors involved in that. But the one that stands out to me is that the Japanese healthcare system is focused on preventative health. When you start to have an emotional problem, you can be, prescribed to go for a walk in the woods and spend time with the natural world, rather than given a bunch of pills that only suppress the symptoms and don't actually get to that deeper spiritual core. And this then leads me back to the tobacco. You know, this is one of the most sacred medicines that we've been gifted by Creator. There are very interesting old stories about where the tobacco spirit came from, how it emerged into our plane. And yet most people hate tobacco at this point. They've been taught to totally despise the plant. Western culture commodified it and perverted the genetic structure and turned it into something, and when you pervert something that's sacred, of course it's going to become unhealthy. But the response to that has been to just turn everyone towards hating this most sacred medicine that we've been given. And then we're surprised that we have a disconnection from the spirit world in this world. We've thrown away one of the most potent medicines we've been given to connect with that spirit world. And maybe that gets to the colonial modernist incarnation of this artificial domineering worldview, which is also the reduction of reality to passing time and physical space. So it's not just that we seek to treat the symptoms rather than the causes, but that our worldview's reduction of reality to this physical reality that we live in, it doesn't even allow us to understand what the deeper causes of our afflictions are. I think most sicknesses at one level or another start in that relationship that we hold with spirit. It flutters out through our emotions and our mind and our body. But if we don't even understand that there is spirit, or that we are a spiritual being, or that we need to cultivate and respect and tend to that relationship, we can't do, even if we said, we're going to start doing preventative healthcare right now, it would be starkly impossible for us to think of the kind of preventative healthcare that we need, which is a grounded spiritual existence, which is that intimacy that we've been talking about.
I think this is that notion of, wholeness or holistic health, not just we're starting to pay more attention to the effects of trauma and accumulated trauma. So thank you. There's a lot of research and funding starting to go into that and take it more serious. Thank you. That's like just attending to hurting beings. But it's a very clinical based model, and then gets caught in the legal system and who's going to pay for that. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're missing is that I wanted to show you this because I think we're missing a kind of big picture of spirit in how spirit, I keep coming back to, I'm a kind of map maker. Well, this is not mine, this is Ken Wilber's. But it's got inward arc and outward. I think this is the outward arc evolving and then the inward arc going down. And all the sort of different developmental levels. So is that the inward here?
That one's outward.
Outward, yeah. So the idea is that, from this kind of ground of being, right, we arise. and move upon this path of kind of expansion. You can even kind of call it the will, the arising. But we have to return. And that's the inward arc of life and its development. And that completes. And I actually make this a spiral.
This reminds me of some of the models of human evolution describe the teleology of human evolution as this individuating process. But I would say that the moment of the awareness of self is the culmination of the individuation start, the outward. And then human existence, human evolution is all about returning, about collectivization again. And so how do we take these individual egoistic beings and return to that unity? So I think that the model of conscious cultural evolution that I'm fitting would fit nicely to that graph.
Yeah. And this is from the book, The Ottman Project. Ken Wilber's work, Transpersonal View of Development, right, which is a spiritual view, but he incorporates also Western psychology and the science that we did to understand how that development, and then he arcs it on with all the Eastern development. Now, when we bring in the indigenous perspective, then I think we have to modify this again. So this is what I'd call the classic, it's a 1970s, East-West synthesis. But one of the things I wanted to share with you, look, the outward arc, the move from subconsciousness, so the outward arc is that beginning, the rising development, ontology. The outward arc is the move from the subconscious to self-conscious. Is only half of the story. I've teaching a model sometimes by Sam Keen, and he says there's at least sort of, we'd be a lot better off if we had 5 different developmental levels for humans. Child, rebel, adult, that's 3. We're halfway. 4th one is the outlaw, and the 5th one's the lover. If we had developmental models like that, we would complete that arc a lot easier. So seeing our adult it ends at ego consciousness. Halfway. So I'm interested in these mappings. Will they help people see, oh, there is something actually beyond that? And it's not weird. And so then the sentence I really wanted to read you here, it says, beyond the self-conscious ego, according to mystics and sages, of course, not just mystics, sages, but lies the path of return and the psychology of eternity. The inward arc. So we're missing in our dominant worldview a whole psychology for that inward arc, which is what you're saying. So no wonder we're going to be incomplete in everything we do, everything we design, because we don't carry people from that one arc to the other. We're closing off society right up here. Well, to do that, that means you're actually injuring. You're injuring all those potentials. Doesn't mean you're destroying them completely, because they're always there, right? That arc is there because of people have traveled there before we know how to do it. And we're all the same spirit, but you're injuring spirit every time you stop that progression to its highest potential. So, you could use the simple language, we need to teach human potential. And we had that in the 60s, 50s, right? Especially in North America in the 60s, the human potential movement. What happened to it? Well, most of it got appropriated. Big time. And then once businesses and organizations took on what human potential was, is they wanted to make better workers who would be healthier longer, do more work, and get less. Nice appropriation. And so you've got this, in the Foucauldian sense, we've got incredible self-disciplined people out there, right? Disciplining the self to the ultimate degree, and timing their all their activities, and carrying the bit watches, and so it's kind of there's some good to that, right? Health, wellness, but you just, from a Foucauldian critical perspective, we got to look at, whoa, are we ever self-disciplining ourselves? And I think that's why I want to go to the last part of our conversation. What are practices of the nothing, infinite, eternal? not practices of how to develop that ego consciousness to be super, super, and even maybe spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
No. What are practices of the nothing, infinity, and eternal? So I have one I'll just throw out. Every time I confront a white or a black surface when I do my art, drawing, coloring, I feel like I come to that nothing, to the infinite, the eternal in some way, but I'm not going to even go there. But I come to a certain sense of the nothing. And what I want to share with you is that I've been doing this for many, many years, and I'm very aware of coming to that encounter. And I practice it as an aesthetic practice because it's really important for me to keep coming to that encounter. And then, you start something, you start making some marks or something, right? Here's one I was doing just the other day. Where do you start? You're sitting in front of something white. You're not trying to make anything. You start somewhere. And that is this message. You start somewhere. And so then my future part of my thinking goes, oh, but is that good art? Is that going to look good? Is this going to turn out? Am I going to waste my time? I have to confront that all the time. When I'm feeling very vulnerable, and I've shared I've got this cold right now, and it's actually put me into, I haven't slept for 2 nights. I can't sleep. There's something in my brain won't allow me to sleep. And I'm very exhausted emotionally. And I feel very irrational at times. I was telling Barbara, it's like there's another part of my brain that is not me, and I'm swamped by this worry. I'm swamped by fear, etc. about a lot of different things. Part of it is the ecological crisis going on right now, and global warmings. And I'm watching myself not being fully in control of my mind. And maybe partly through, this infection illness related. And of course, we know a lot of mystics and shamans throughout history have had illness has been a prime kickover or inspiration for. I'm actually practicing coming into the nothing when I lay in the middle of the night for 8 hours and cannot sleep. It is one of the most amazing struggles to lay there and try to relax without getting into the future thinking, if I don't get to sleep now, I need to go to the pharmacist, and then I get worse. So how do I come? How do you come? What practices? Because we're not always in the same condition when we come to talk about philosophy of, the NIE. Yeah. There's such a human vulnerability that I am learning right now to be humble to. Oh my God, this is really hard. I may know what practices to do, but when I'm in that really vulnerable, irrational space, I was watching myself. I should know what to do. I can't access them. Like my being would not allow me to access. So I went to a tree. I walked out to a tree that I've been adopting for the last while. One of the practices Barbara taught. Adopt a tree or practice with a tree and get to know it. And I just spent time out there. And as soon as I got to the tree, I just had a certain sense that it represents the eternal, the infinite, all life, all and more than life. It's not just about life. There's no even division about life. It was just so symbolic of the kind of the whole. But I was afraid to face the nothingness. I was aware of it, like in that vulnerable, irrational state. Right? I want a solution. I want to grab something.
Interesting.
So what practices? And I think even maybe, the rituals that you were talking about earlier. I know what I would have loved because I was alone. Barbara's away, and I don't really know many people here, so I had to deal with this on my own. And it would have been so great to be with somebody in nature, in ritual, in using all these greater other connections to the NIE. But I think it's so important that we learn how to have that intimate relationship to the NIE. So what practices, and if you want to comment on what I just shared.
I think what you just shared leads me very directly into what I've been thinking as you've been asking this question, which is that the practices that bring me into intimacy with the infinite are those practices that have to do with living beings. It's spending time in the grove during the day with the trees. There's a hemlock and a cedar and a Douglas fir that form a perfect triangle around the clearing. It's working with the tobacco in the garden. It's being a part of that life process, of the emergence of life, of the emergence of the healing energies into those pieces of life. That's where I feel most at one with the infinite. And with the nothingness, I mean, the one that really works for me is walking in the woods in the dark. And so it's the same context as the infinite. It's that same grove, it's those same trees, but it's quiet and I can't see. And so I go into using my ears far more than my eyes. And you know, I go with same group of people every once in a while to the grove, and that you can feel the difference in the conversation when it's light and we're looking at each other and we're in this world of life versus when it's dark, can't see each other's spaces. There's something of that vulnerability that comes out in that space. And I think that's where I feel myself trending towards the nothingness, where I feel that silence, that quiet. And again, I think that there's something special about the fact that it's the same place, but at the different polarities of the day when these different emotions come out. And it's seasonal too. When it's summertime and it's sunny until 10 o'clock in the evening and I'm out working on the land all day, like, I feel energetic. I feel infinite. And it's this time of year and the sun isn't up for very many hours a day and I spend a lot of hours in the darkness outside. I get quiet. I go into those more emotive realms of my being. So maybe riding the wave of the seasons and of the days is kind of my practice for oscillating between those polarities. And always, you know, it's in that deepest state of contemplative nothingness that the visions emerge, that I see things, that I understand where I'm going. And so out of the black emerges the white spot. And in those states of infinity, in that very active state, it's sometimes when the quietest will come. You know, the climax of motion is stillness, and the climax of stillness is motion. And so at some level, it also is about the fact that you can't differentiate those two practices. It is the infinite practices that bring me to stillness, and it's the nothing practices that bring vision, that bring motion in a different plane, perhaps. So maybe that's something to think about, is that dash between them is really essential. It's not the infinite and the nothing, or the nothing and the infinite. It's the nothing infinite. It is one entity as much as it is two entities. And the yin-yang symbol is where I always come back to, with the emergence of one from the center of the other, and the constant oscillation back between those two forms that arises from that. That's where the balance comes. And where, you know, what is the middle way? How can we be both nothing and infinite? Or is it a function of our temporal existence that we are meant to just oscillate back and forth?
Yeah.
That we're meant to attain climaxes of one so as to enter into the other and to move along that path towards a higher vibrational state, you know, back and forth, the energy's building. You know, imagine doing that on some water. Every time you hit it, a new ripple goes through the water. And so over time, the water will become more and more rapid. So what are we doing in this oscillating between the nothing and the infinite?
And could we also add a dimension of the irrational, this really fear-based structure, which I was experiencing, and it's still, I can feel the edges of it because I'm very exhausted right now. And in the rational, in this irrational, that is not even of that binary in some sense. So I'm wondering if there's also, it's riding the wave of that. That's sort of what I'm doing right now. Like, I did some art because I was in that really irrational space, and when I just did art and worked on that nothing and just produced something, it helped a bit. When I went to the tree, it definitely helped me too. And yet I'm always riding the irrational too. And this is what I was kind of wondering. When you're in a more high state of the irrational takeover, which is so common for people, and I know you've experienced certain phobia reactions and syndromes and so on in your life, particularly in the social realm. Do you find a way to move to the NIE when you're in that irrational more? Because it's like it's more easy to go there when you're kind of still pretty centered.
I go and sit by myself in the woods. It's pretty simple, I guess, or on the beach, but I sit somewhere where the beauty of nature can enfold me, and I can move on from that. If we talk about eternal courage rising from intimacy with the nothing infinite eternal, I go to those places where I find that intimacy. And in finding that intimacy and being with my friends, being with the trees, being with the mushrooms, being with all the ferns, all the life forms in that space, with the land, with the waters, in the grove. So you have red cedar, hemlock, and then straight ahead would be the Douglas fir. Right in the middle, there's a big stump of an old Douglas fir that's died. And on either side, there are these two perfect pools that have been forming over the past couple of days. And so the waters are there too, I guess is the point that I'm making. Anyway, there's something about that getting out of the context of this world that are designed to beget that kind of irrational, fear-based state, and moving into a space where I have help, where I'm not doing it alone, where I'm not cut off from that help.
Yeah, in 4 Arrows, he book on Connoisseur of Fear, he starts off, says, all creatures have learned how to deal with fear for a very long time. Humans ought to pretty well learn from them.
Yeah.
So I'm paraphrasing, but it was a very interesting difference between if you're looking at the fear management literature out there in the world, right? Because I have to sort of study that stuff to kind of know where they're coming from. And then when you looked at that concept, right, that more indigenous worldview perspective. So that's where we learn about fear, we learn about courage, fearlessness, etc. So thanks, Luke, for this today. That was a really nice piece, and I think I'd encourage people to look at our first Fear Talk if you could, and put it together with this one, and who knows, we might do another one in the future. Thanks very much, Luke.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
All the best.